Hello everyone and welcome to the latest course in my dissection of PT Silent Hills. My name is Loveless and tonight we're going to be taking a thorough look at atmosphere and why PT absolutely excels at creating one of, if not the, most intense atmospheres in a video game I have ever stepped into. Horror games thrive on creating an atmosphere that is dreadful for the player to experience. Think back to all the best horror games you've played, close your eyes, and just imagine what it would be like in that world yourself. The faint drip of water on stone floors in a pitch-black labyrinth. The ear-raking creak of the wooden floors against every step you take in an unknown land as the words of the dead grow louder with each passing second. The sound of enormous and yet rusty science fiction machinery clanging as your breaths tensely echo against the nothingness of space. For a video game to create a proper atmosphere is absolutely crucial. This isn't exclusive to horror games, of course. I think it applies to any other genre equally. Fallout New Vegas, Transistor, Shadow of the Colossus, Mass Effect, Jak 2, Deus Ex, Sons of Liberty, Bloodborne, Death Stranding, all of these games create utterly phenomenal atmospheres that help push them to the highest tiers of their respective genres. As crucial a component as it is, I feel as though it's important for me to pin down just what exactly I mean by atmosphere. When I say atmosphere, I'm referring to how the game's audio-visual designs work in tandem with the construction of the moment-to-moment gameplay to elevate the experience as a whole beyond the sum of its parts. A game's atmosphere is also created by context within the game world and functions as an overall setup for the mood the developers want the player to be in when experiencing their story. Examples of horror games that utterly excel at producing a strong atmosphere include the first two Dead Space games, Amnesia: The Dark Descent, Soma, Silent Hill 2, and Resident Evil. I don't think there are many people that would argue that PT doesn't have strong atmosphere, but what exactly is it that makes the game so nerve-wracking to play? What is it that makes the game's atmosphere so effective in instilling dread? There's actually a great deal to cover here, but if you don't mind me starting out rather plainly, I'd like to take a moment to credit this game for the shocking degree of photorealism its graphics have managed to reach. This demo has existed for over half a decade now, and it's still the closest I've ever seen a game come to photorealism. Don't get me wrong, plenty of games are definitely nearing the threshold of photorealism as we approach the 9th generation. Death Stranding, Devil May Cry 5, Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice, all of these games look incredible and have animations that are second to none. For now though, I think PT still holds the crown for pure photorealism. The game's got an obvious edge over plenty of other titles. It's running on the Fox engine, which alone is going to put it well above most other games of its time, but given just how focused the game is, with the tight hallway and lack of dynamic rendering required, it's no wonder that PT is so lifelike. The Fox engine made Metal Gear Solid 5 into a technical powerhouse, so it's not much of a surprise that when compressed into a game as small as PT that the engine would be capable of such incredible visual fidelity. I think one of the reasons PT is so utterly terrifying is in part due to its photorealism. The game has aged like fine wine, and there's a very real sense of tangibility to the overall aesthetic. For instance, when you look at the photographs, they don't stand out as awkwardly realistic amidst the environment. They fit right in. Again, I think a large part of what has made PT age so well is the lack of dynamic rendering, and there only being a handful of complex animations that occur in-game, several of which are supposed to stand out as unrealistic anyways. When it comes down to it, the only animations they really had to nail in terms of realism were the initial waking up animation, the fetus in the sink, the bag moving, the swinging chandelier and refrigerator, the blood spill from the refrigerator, the glass object being thrown from the balcony, picking up the flashlight in the bathroom, doors opening and closing, and the roaches. I'm not including the eyeball pictures in the final red hallway segment because, from what I can tell, they're just cycling JPEGs. Pretty much every other animation that occurs in the game is to do with Lisa, who is clearly supposed to stand out as paranormal, therefore would have generally more complex, albeit less grounded animations anyways. I don't want to make it seem as though technical quality is all there is to creating a proper horror game. There are, of course, many games that have been put together on shoestring budgets by incredibly small teams, if not a single person, that turned out to be not only effective, but largely impactful on the genre as a whole, for better or worse. However, PT definitely came out at a time where this type of budget was rarely, if ever, seen in horror games. At this point, we were 3 years removed from Dead Space 2 and still had over a year until the next truly great horror game in Soma. And even then, I doubt Soma or Alien Isolation's budgets even came close to what Konami was pouring into the Fox engine at the time. I can't confirm this, as hard budget numbers are difficult to come across with video games, but it is pretty well documented that Konami executives hated the Fox engine for costing a small fortune to develop games on, and Kojima had developed quite the reputation for taking a great deal of time, manpower, and funding to develop his games. So it makes sense that he would want to go as all out as possible in something he would have been so passionate about. My point here is that at this point in time, it was just nice to see a horror game being made with incredible funding and graphical quality. On the flip side, plenty of great horror games are quite dated when it comes to their graphical quality. The first 3 Silent Hill and Resident Evil games may not have been the most impressive visually, but they are still thought of rather fondly because their environments were so memorable. We all remember the foggy aesthetic of the first Silent Hill games, the terrifying mansion of the first Resident Evil, the dilapidated 90s infrastructure of Resident Evils 2 and 3. Anyone who's played these games will be able to remember, at least to some extent, several key locations from each game. PT shares a similar quality with these games through its L-shaped corridor. I think even if PT were to one day somehow look mediocre graphically, its infamous corridor and top-tier ghost girl waifu Lisa would still both be thought of very fondly due to how impactful they were on the player, and how visually striking they were regardless of photorealism. Everyone who has played this game is going to remember the hallway, or at the very least the moment they first realized they were trapped in a loop as they gazed down the same stretch of the exact same hall. The hallway is realistic on an aesthetic and graphical level, but in keeping with Japanese horror tradition, there's something subconsciously off about it overall. Why is this radio right in front of the front door? How in the hell are you supposed to get upstairs? These aren't questions that necessarily need to be answered. After all, we are dealing with a paranormal hallway that is looping infinitely, but these things will typically make the player scratch their chin and wonder just what the deal is. Much like the questions posed by the story, it's not about whether or not they can even be answered. It's how they engage the player, both consciously and subconsciously. There very well could be answers. For example, maybe the radio is right in front of the front door because the main character was so obsessed with it that he wanted to turn it on as soon as he got home. It could be a metaphorical representation turned physical, or it could have literally been just like that. We'll never know, but the tangibility of the possibilities makes for a much more engaging experience. Of course, engagement and immersion can be completely ruined if the game fails in auditory direction. This, I feel, is especially true for horror games. Try and imagine playing Amnesia: The Dark Descent without that shrill chase music, or Resident Evil 2 without the echo of Mr. X's footsteps.
God, I can hear his footsteps coming. The big guy's coming. Oh no! Yeah. Okay, he's in here. He's in here. Go! Go! Come on, you bastard! Get it! Oh fuck! He didn't like that when I shot that.
If you were to do so, there would be an immediate sense of detraction from the experience, and the game would suffer a great deal from it.
There we go.
Sound quality is utterly crucial to horror games, and it's here that I think PT is at its strongest. What I'd like to highlight is how PT uses particularly eerie sound design to convey the paranormal, so as to elevate the mood as the player progresses. To clarify, think for a moment just how everything matches the photorealistic environment at first. The light that sways back and forth creaks eerily. The radio has an appropriate level of static sputtering from its broadcasts. Even your footsteps match your footwear and the surface they're pressing against with each step. When you start playing, there is really nothing unusual or even paranormal, but it's still enough to get you on your toes. It's just as vaguely creepy as any hallway can be during a stormy midnight hour. Then after your first encounter with the ghost Lisa, suddenly you're hearing things that you can't quite comprehend or put a mental image to. Not just Lisa's bizarre wailing and laughter, but the static and weird electronic tisms that occur with each haunting. Where is that noise supposed to be coming from? What does it even represent? Like many things in PT, you could reasonably hypothesize a number of explanations, but there really is no certain answer to what these sounds even are. Hell, if we want to look at it from a more meta perspective, we're probably never even going to know what Kojima Productions was using to create these sounds, making their origins all the more difficult to get a grasp of. These hauntings are utterly bone-chilling because they seem to occur at random and they can overwhelm the player on an auditory level similarly to the chase music in Amnesia: The Dark Descent. This is an extremely risky practice for any game developer because if it were to become repetitive, then it would be more annoying than terrifying. It's the type of audio that needs to be designed and implemented with the overall structure of the game in mind. Amnesia accomplished this by being sparing with its creature encounters and not applying the same effect to each creature. For example, the water monster. PT is similarly sparing in that you won't hear the effect for the majority of the game, which is already quite short as it is. You generally won't come across the haunting effect until you're pretty far into the game, and the only places you're likely to even get stuck on are the Hell puzzle and the final puzzle, the former of which most people don't seem to struggle with that much anyways. On top of this, the effect itself has enough variety in what you hear, And there's enough disorientation the player will be dealing with in the latter part of the game, so it's unlikely the player will be getting annoyed or even bored by it in their time playing PT. Honestly, it's just a brilliant piece of sound design. So what we now have are unintelligible sounds bombarding us within a hyper-realistic, yet increasingly bizarre environment. This, of course, would lead to a feeling of disorientation or general perplexion in the audience, one of which grows in tandem with the increasingly terrifying hallway loops, further offset by the increasingly obtuse puzzles you have to manage a degree of focus to solve, even if you've done it before. However, it takes more than just being perplexing, overwhelming, and weird to be an effective work of horror. So now that we have an understanding of how it is the audio visuals come together to affect the player, just what is it that makes all of this so scary? Even superficially, PT's hallway is dreadful and even nerve-wracking to spend time in. The aesthetics certainly help elevate it beyond your average horror experience, and the sound design is state-of-the-art. However, it takes more than surface-level scares to make a truly terrifying experience. The hallway isn't just terrifying to walk through because it looks the part, but also because it's constructed mechanically to keep the player on their toes at all times. The primary concern for the player is that your backside is always vulnerable, and if it's not, then you're more than likely not progressing as you should be, thus leaving yourself more vulnerable to an attack from the ghost. So you need to be able to navigate the hallway with some degree of understanding. The lack of concrete understanding of Lisa's AI certainly helps increase the tension also. You truly never know when your next major turn is going to put you face to face with the ghost. It's almost like a Rubik's Cube in the sense that, while you've got to try and navigate the hallway and solve its puzzles, which will generally only be picked up on by observing extremely subtle details, you've also got to keep in mind how Lisa might be behaving, and what you could do to set her off. As I said before, this becomes even more difficult to manage once you realize that Lisa's AI works outside the general understanding of the game's rules, a fact that the player will more than likely stumble across in a variety of ways, which I'll be sure to cover in the Lisa section of the videos. There's a sense of urgency in that you need to figure these puzzles out very quickly, all the while paying attention to very minute details, all of which can be difficult to manage while you're having the shit scared out of you. The terrifying aesthetics add to the sense of urgency by generally making you feel like you want to get out of the hallway as fast as possible. The sense of urgency causes you to try and act hastily and perhaps leave yourself prone to making a mistake, increasing your sense of vulnerability. Your understood sense of vulnerability then makes the aesthetics even more terrifying, as you mentally feel more open to harm than you would otherwise. It's a literal cycle of increasing terror, horror ad infinitum. Of course, I'm not saying the game is literally objectively terrifying to a sum infinite, but once again that everything in the game is working together in tandem to create, as Nakey Jakey so well put it, the ultimate cocktail of interactive terror. So now that I've provided a fundamental breakdown as to why the atmosphere in PT is so effective, and how it works on a more mechanical level, I'm going to discuss how it is that the atmosphere is established at various points in the game. This way we can examine the game's mood and pacing in action, and make a more thorough deduction of the overall atmosphere as a whole, and where better a place to start than the very beginning. After the initial startup, which itself is notably silent and lacking in fluff and logos, we wake up in a concrete room. When the door creaks open, if you happen to be examining it extremely closely with high enough brightness settings, you may be able to make out a certain ghostly figure peeping in on you. Most people, of course, are unlikely to notice this on their very first playthrough. After stepping out into the hallway, the silence persists with the only sounds of note being your footsteps, the creak of the foyer light, the rain outside, and of course the radio. As simplistic as it is, I find this opening atmosphere to be extremely effective because it perfectly replicates a feeling that any human being is familiar with, being alone at home at night in a hallway. It's a very familiar motif that immediately provides a sense of genuine tangibility to the experience, which in turn makes the slow drip of the paranormal far more effective as the game progresses. This is a key trope to any Japanese horror story, the existence of the paranormal in familiar environments. Think about Ju-on, where the story takes place primarily within what anyone would be able to recognize as that creepy house down the street, or The Ring, which revolves around a creepy tape that just happened to be stumbled across. After a few mostly uneventful loops, we get our first true taste of the outright paranormal when we try to take a peek into the bathroom. That's when we get our first real look at the ghost, Lisa, but only briefly, and immediately following this there is a sharp, high-pitched ambiance that seems to exist primarily to convey to the player that the paranormal is about to be placed front and center. This is our second jump scare at this point in the game, however it's the first where we've been provided a perceivable threat, so now more than ever there is a heightened urge to move along. In the following loop, as we continue down the corridor, we're still able to hear Lisa's moaning from our right, leading the player to believe initially that she's still in the bathroom. However, once we turn the corner, we of course realize that this is far from the truth. Lisa is standing right there in full view, halting our progress. Or so we think. We of course don't have any choice. She refuses to move and we have nothing that we can interact with, so we approach her and just as we get close enough, the lights click off. As we approach where she stood, we can still hear her bizarre moaning. At this point, any player sporting a headset of even mediocre quality will be able to hear Lisa relative to her in the player's position, meaning as you cross the threshold of where she stood, it will sound as though she's in your head, and as you proceed, she will sound as if she's behind you. What's even more interesting is that if you turn around back to where she stood, she won't appear and kill you as she would in other instances later in the game. Meaning anyone who was curious enough to try this on their first run is surely not going to be spoiled on how turning around to where Lisa could be is usually punished. This moment's brilliant because now the player is feeling completely baffled as to what the ghost is even doing. It's a great way of establishing unease without disrupting the pacing. On top of that, it's possible that even the most cocksure players will be perceiving her as a non-threat and proceeding without any sense of caution, making them more open to what Lisa could potentially do. Following this is the loop where we're given the flashlight. Once we pick it up, the door is slammed on us and we're locked in the bathroom. After some investigation, we find a living fetus in the sink that is struggling and crying. The ambiance immediately picks up and we hear a door opening from the hallway outside. Footsteps approach the bathroom doorway as the baby begins to cry even louder. The handle turns, but for one reason or another, it doesn't open. It's never suggested outright, but given all we've seen up to this point, the player will almost certainly assume that the one trying to open the door must have been the ghost. And they would actually be right.
The sound of the lobby door opening and footsteps coming our way before stopping right by the bathroom door, with whatever is out there seemingly trying to get in. Because all of this plays out through the clever use of sound and vague implication, it might be safe to assume that of course there's nothing actually out there. However, by moving the camera to the hallway during this event, which would never normally be possible, we discover that this is not at all the case. Please don't mind if I show this from a variety of angles, as I was so shocked to discover this scene, I couldn't help but take the time to capture it from every possible perspective. And so we're able to see the attention to detail that went into creating this wholly unseen moment, complete with bespoke animations for Lisa that are never used elsewhere.
Lance McDonald's investigations of PT actually revealed that Lisa was in fact the one trying to get into the bathroom. This moment definitely exists to convey to the player that Lisa is no longer just screwing with us, she's coming for us. Shortly after this, we enter one of my favorite moments in the game. The player will begin hearing the same radio broadcast they heard at the start of the game, except it isn't quite the same. There's a much more pervasive static, and at certain points there will be radio interference, from the same speaker as the initial broadcast, speaking subliminally to the listener. This alone is perplexing, but eventually he speaks directly to the player, telling them to look behind you. And if you do, well, you may or may not regret that. I say may, because it's actually possible that you'll turn around and not be punished for it. Regardless, this is a great way for the game to directly convey to the player that the systems in place recognize turning around as a decision that can, and in many cases will, be punished. There's also a short instance in the very loop prior to making the turn into the foyer where you can see Lisa's shadow being projected before your flashlight. The first time I noticed this, I assumed that the flashlight, having just been introduced, would serve as some sort of mechanic that allowed me to spot where Lisa might be. However, once I moved the flashlight slightly to my right, it dawned on me. Her shadow was moving relative to my back's positioning. That was, of course, my own deduction, but as it eventually turned out, Lance McDonald's investigation into PT actually revealed that Lisa's character model was physically placed behind the player.
As we turn to look, the shadow seems to also move to the side. And any investigation suggests that nothing is really there. Interacting with the framed photo in the lobby causes this phenomena to come to an end, and the shadow never reappears after this. More interesting though is that this is much more than just some cheap trick played for scares. Of course, the suggestion here being that the ghost has begun to follow us, all the while avoiding being seen. But if we apply a small patch to the game engine, making it impossible for our facing direction to be properly tracked, we can turn around and discover whether there's really anything there. So indeed, Lisa is actually behind us through the entirety of this particular haunting. And there she remains until we interact with the lobby photo frame, at which point she instantly disappears.
Who was shot in the stomach was 204-863. Seen after neighbors called 911 found the father in his car listening to the radio. Several days before the murder, look behind you. I said, look behind you.
We now have two choices, to press onward or turn around. As you surely know, we have to proceed. However, if you do turn around, you'll more than likely be punished for it. So one way or the other, either in this instance or by listening to the radio, this section of the game conveys to the player that you are at your safest when you're making progress and moving forward, and that it is a major risk to be turning around. What's interesting is how you're not guaranteed to be caught by Lisa here even if you do turn around. This would almost seem to indicate that there is some degree of leniency regarding the puzzles, implying that if you happen to be misled or not initially understand something, you aren't guaranteed to be punished for it. Of course, most of this is unlikely to be recognized in a single first-time playthrough, primarily due to the level of stress most players would be feeling, but the systems are definitely there and offer some degree of accomplishment to the more perceptive players, as well as just enough guidance for any player that may or may not be completely lost at this point. So now that the player has been presented with what is essentially the number one rule for handling puzzles, move forward and don't turn around, the game can really start having its fun. At this point, players who have been paying attention will have a basic grasp of the systems in place, but not enough knowledge of the game as a whole to have it completely figured out. Players who haven't been paying attention will be completely lost and punished for their inability to deduce the game's mechanics. That's not a slight to those players, by the way. The vast majority of people don't have a single clue what's going on with this game their first time through, myself included. It took me ages for me to figure out that the blue cross on the picture was telling me to gouge it out by pressing the X button. Anyways, from this point onward, when the game begins to implement new and successful scare tactics, it will either throw the more cautious players off guard, or, in regards to players that are already lost, they'll be left in a state of even greater disorientation. The game is now in a place where it has established a firm grip over the player's perception, and it can begin to play with that perception as it sees fit. Another important aspect of the atmosphere to keep in mind is lighting. Lighting is a simple and effective way for the developer to influence the mood of a scene or level in any game, and it's used to great effect in PT. When we first start the game, there's almost a sense of warmness to the lighting. All the lights are on and everything's fine, although there is an air of creepiness thanks to the pitch blackness of the night just outside the window that even the light from the house is barely able to make a dent in. As things begin to pick up and become more paranormal, the lights begin to turn off one at a time so as to visually convey to the player that they are quite literally descending into the darkness. Things don't stop there though.
Alright, well, consider this pair of pants officially ruined.
This is probably my favorite section in the entire game. I'll go over the puzzle itself in more depth later on, but that's not to say there isn't a load to discuss here in regards to the overall presentation, as if that wasn't already apparent. This moment, for me at least, was just as memorable as the first time I walked through the first loop doorway. The immediate sense of dread is spine-chilling. Everything has been escalating slowly, but suddenly here, the game hits you straight in the face, and it's enough to stop most players in their tracks for at least a moment.
Yo!
That's like fucking, Ju-on style.
Yo, these fucking ghosts, man!
No, what type of ghosts are these? What type of ghosts?
Shut up.
Fucking chicken restaurant is right outside the door.
Like.
Oh, Minecraft, man. My balls just subtracted inside my body. I am now boneless. I mean, I am now oh, god damn. Uh-huh. What? What do you want? That's actually kind of nice. Oh.
Oh, what the hell was that? Oh boy! Oh boy! Oh boy! Oh good! Oh good! Oh, it's a trap! Oh! Oh! Why is it oozing? The eternal question burning in everyone's mind. Why is it oozing? That's gonna fall on me.
After killing his family, the father hung himself with a garden hose they had in the garage.
Ah. Okay, bye.
I hear water. Does that come from the bathroom? That's blood! What is that? Baby! Is that a fridge?
Okay, that doesn't sound right. What is this, blood? It's gonna be like The Shining. Am I gonna get washed away? That sounds very... What is that? Ugh. Another hazard. How is that a fridge?
The starkness of the red light cutting against the shadows, the immediately heavy ambient sound that almost growls at the player, the blood spilling almost at a pace from the refrigerator that is for some reason hanging where a light once was, the radio man's back at it again, everything's just perfect. Just a goddamn knockout moment in horror. After spending so much time slowly leading us into the horror of PT at a drip pace, the atmosphere is cranked to 11, as if to say, the gloves are coming off. This is also the first instance I've been able to find in the game following Lisa's introduction, where she personally appears in a way that isn't immediately considered a fail state to the player. Earlier, she appeared to us from the upstairs balcony, but now she can appear in the hallway with us. This moment appears to be completely random as well, as I've been unable to find a reliable trigger for the event, or even a consistent period of time that it might occur. If you get too close to her, which, I mean, why would you, you'll be hit with what I can only describe as one of the greatest jump scares in any video. At this point, you're in a state of possession. I don't want to go too in-depth with the mechanic right now, but the important thing to note is that you will now hear Lisa's voice, non-stop, until either you progress or she kills you. On top of this, there will be a third footstep as you walk. There doesn't seem to be a consistent timer counting down to your death, and there doesn't seem to be a reliable trigger for it either. Even turning around doesn't seem to do anything, most of the time. With all of this going on, we've got to solve a puzzle that requires us to move the camera back and forth several times. As we know by now, turning the camera is a nerve-wracking move to make, so when we have to do it so many times while the game is being at its most oppressive and downright terrifying, you can probably see why this particular section of the game would cause the player, or at least myself, so much anxiety. It's bloody fantastic. The sense of escalation is brilliantly paced and caps off with one hell of a puzzle. This is also probably the first puzzle that will stump the majority of players, meaning that for a lot of people, you're going to be spending an uncomfortably long period of time here. We then move on to the section of the game where things begin to get really weird. The atmosphere here is immediately much more subdued. The haunting ambiance is replaced by the buzzing of the radio. We don't hear Lisa at all anymore. The hanging refrigerator is replaced by the swinging light, which is no longer creaking, and is emitting a red light that's more soft and bright compared to the one previously seen. The radio is also no longer taunting us, at least in a language most people watching this video, I imagine, are capable of understanding. The player can finally just take a moment to breathe and listen to the almost calming sounds of the radio, even if the new broadcaster is just as malevolent as the last. So after being given a moment to breathe, we then begin what I can only describe as the Bizarro segment. We move much faster here to the point of having difficulty controlling the player character. There's also a heavier and much more immediate screen blurring effect as we turn the camera. In addition, all of the paintings have been replaced by moving pictures of eyes. There's a newer ambiance that's more disorienting than impressive, and the hallway is no longer descending into a loop, but endlessly repeating on its own, with the overall design of the hallway being far more nonsensical as conveyed by the inverted locations throughout it. As you can probably tell, even though this isn't the most oppressive and dreadful atmosphere in the game, it's quite perplexing. On top of that, the player will more than likely be quite shaken given just how utterly terrifying things have been prior to this. Here we have to find a peephole in the wall, which, for anyone playing this the first time, will be pretty difficult given all that's going on and all that's happened up to this point. This makes sense given how things climaxed earlier with the Hell puzzle, and that we were given a moment of reprieve between then and now. This segment is actually capped off by a primarily auditory story beat that, provided the player has been paying even a little attention, will come as a pretty huge revelation. That revelation being the murder of a woman that we can only guess is Lisa. Once we are removed from the peephole, we see some text above it telling us, "No turning back now." The ambiance has completely dissipated, the intense motion blur is no longer there, and we're walking as we were prior to entering this hallway. What's more, if we literally do try and turn back, we'll just end up walking into a wall, meaning the only option we have is to move forward. I also found it interesting that it was just a wall here instead of a locked door, as if to imply this is the start of something new, rather than a continuation of what was. That is, of course, just some speculation on my end, but it was interesting nonetheless. Given what just happened in the bathroom from our view of the peephole, the player will be inclined to investigate further. When we do enter the bathroom, we're greeted by the fetus from before, who is now speaking to us in an unnaturally deep voice. Enough here is revealed to suggest that the player character lived in this house with a woman. Given what we just heard, with a woman being brutally murdered from within the bathroom, it's pretty clear to anyone paying attention that the player character is almost definitely responsible for the death of this woman, Lisa. I know I've already covered the story, but I feel it's important to retread that ground here, as this is a very significant moment in the game, and it sets a very particular mood for the player. This knowledge, or perhaps insinuation, flips the player's perception of Lisa over completely, and is critical in regards to understanding the story. We've just learned, or at least have been suggested to, that we're playing as the man responsible for the death of the ghost that's haunting us. Following this, we walk down the silent hall of red and eventually turn to an elongated hallway that seems to transition back to what we understand here as normal. The atmosphere itself has completely quieted down and given us pause. However, we now have to reflect on the fact that we are responsible for what happened to the angry spirit that has terrorized us within these halls, and try to make sense of the various story implications surrounding that. This definitely feels like a conclusion to the story itself, so the player will almost certainly be wondering if this is the end of the game. After making the loop once more, the silence continues, at least momentarily. After a while, the screen begins to bug out, eventually tearing. We hear the number sequence from before repeated multiple times and a baby crying. The game seems to be suggesting that things aren't quite over yet. That is, of course, until we're hit with one of several crash screens. The game then appears to restart and the player is left with nothing to make sense of. If ever there was a "what the fuck just happened" moment in PT, this would definitely be it. The fourth wall has now completely collapsed, and we're transitioning from what is essentially the climax of the story to the revelation of what the game is actually supposed to be. It's here that we've arrived at what I dub the truth sequence. I'll talk more about the mechanics of this part in the puzzle section, but it's important to note that this part of the game is excellent at making the player feel as though they're in the place that they're not supposed to be. After the fourth wall break that sends the player back to the concrete room, things begin to feel really alien. For starters, even though the game appears to have restarted, the player is bound to notice that they still have the flashlight, which was absent at the start of the game. Upon opening the door into the hallway, there will be no source of light aside from the flashlight and the digital clock. Up to this point, the clock has either been stuck on 23:59, or, following the Bizarro segment, turned off completely. However, if the player stays in a single loop for too long, which they have to in order to solve the final puzzle, the clock will finally turn over to midnight, at which point a bell gong can be heard and a haunting will ensue. Prior to the clock hitting midnight, the hallway is completely silent, so the sudden shift to an oppressive atmosphere is a great way of making the player feel as though they're entering a dangerous territory of sorts. There's also this weird deal with the flashlight during this sequence where it will sometimes turn green, yellow, blue, or red. To this day, no explanation of this has been found. In my honest opinion, I think it was just Pewdiepie playing around with the Fox engine. It does allow for some visually distinct scares though, which can be a great way to make the game more memorable for some players. Personally speaking, the blue light is the most dreadful for me due to this unforgettably horrifying moment a few years back that I actually referenced earlier from when I was in college. On top of the weird stuff with the flashlight, there are some unique encounters with Lisa that can occur during this sequence. I'll also be going over those more in depth in the next section. There's so much going on in this sequence that makes it feel so distinct from the rest of the game, even outside the puzzle itself. It's interesting because the game itself already feels so oppressive in nature, but upon entering the truth sequence, it's as if you found a rabbit hole within a rabbit hole, and that things only get weirder and more unknowable from here. On top of being simultaneously perplexing and crushingly oppressive, the player also has to deal with what can only be described as one of the most esoteric puzzles in video game history, making the truth sequence one of the most genuinely memorable pieces of any horror game I've ever played. It's difficult to describe because of just how utterly bizarre and cut off from the rest of the game that it is, so I hope you feel as though I've done an adequate enough job at conveying the sense of atmosphere felt in this final level. On top of being utterly terrifying just on a superficial level with its surreal and photorealistic audio-visual effects, PT is constructed and paced in a way that immediately grabs the player with a tangible reality, only to drip-feed supernatural elements, which continuously escalate until finally reaching points of pure surreality. I think this has been the most fun I've had so far in analyzing this game, because the level of detail and craftsmanship on display is fascinating to piece together. Although I recognize that what scares people is ultimately subjective, I've got to say that on an objective scale, PT absolutely knocks it out of the park in sheer quality of horror direction. You can just tell that everyone who worked on this demo over at Pewdiepie was having a blast. Not just Cosima and Del Toro, but everyone on staff that helped make this complete and utter masterpiece of horror. I'll be going through them all individually in my concluding piece, but for now, I just want to show as much appreciation to them as I can. Because this game truly is every bit as scary as people say it is. Once again, I want to thank you all so much for watching. I've officially completed part 3 of the essay, and to be perfectly honest, I can't believe I've even got this far. I've got something of a Da Vinci complex where I'll start something and really enjoy it, but halfway through it I'll just get bored and stop. So for me, this is a pretty big accomplishment. It's been a hugely enjoyable piece of work for me, and I've got about 4 more parts to go, meaning the conclusion of this is the halfway point, if we count the intro. Seriously, I mean it from the bottom of my heart when I say that I appreciate all of you who are viewing this, even if there are only a few of you and even just a single person found some value in it. Once again, I encourage you to leave a comment providing your thoughts so far and telling me what you think of my work. Any and all feedback is definitely appreciated, even if it's as little as clicking the like or dislike button. My name is Loveless, and as always, thanks for watching.